I've got an absolutely terrifying Bigfoot encounter in store for you tonight. I've got a gentleman with me that is from my home state of Arkansas, and he was just a kid. He had an encounter with this thing. Well, 3 months later, this creature tried to break into his house, and his mom took a shot at this thing. This story is really good, and you don't want to miss 1 second of it. But before we jump into any of it, I just want to say thank you for being here. I couldn't do this podcast without you. If you've had an encounter, I would love to hear it. You can always email me at mysteriesunknownpodcast@gmail.com. But let's jump right into this story.
I live in Arkansas, but at the point that I had my encounter, I was between 10 and 11 years old. I had grown up in the woods all my life with my uncle and my stepfather. And at that point, I was not afraid of the woods because it was just something we did all the time. Either deer hunting, squirrel hunting, or whatever happens, uh, watching animals just play in the woods. We lived in a very small rural community at the time that I had my encounter. The area was mostly wooded, flat hardwoods, and then also had some dense vegetation because of the swamps that were in the area. These swamps were thick. I did not venture into the swamps without my stepfather. This was an area that just had a few houses on it, and they all backed up against the edge of the woods in this town. And all of us kids in the neighborhood played in the woods and around in that area because that's pretty much all there was to do. I can remember coming home with my brother after school, and the first thing we'd usually do is hit the woods. And he and I went out playing, and we were playing fake army. I'm not sure. It had to do with guns. At that point, I didn't have a gun with me. We were just using sticks. Uh, and we got tired, and I went in the house with my brother, uh, and then I came back out because I wasn't finished playing, and I did get my stepfather's 22 rifle because I thought maybe a squirrel would come along. But I was out there uh, looking around, and I heard a loud pop, uh, and this noise was so loud it just made me stop. I stopped in my tracks. The area did have a lot of leaves because of the trees, a lot of limbs. But when I turned around, all I could see was a brown something on the way up, starting to stand up on 2 feet. I can remember that vividly because it had to duck its head to keep from hitting on the limb that was just above in the tree. And when it stood up, its head was up over the tree, up over that limb. So I know it was a pretty high, he was pretty tall. My guess, 6, 7, 8 foot tall. To a 10-year-old boy, he was probably about 20 foot tall, but that was just the fear in me. Um, I can tell you that he looked at me, and what I saw was uh, brown eyes. That's all I can remember is brown, dark brown eyes with white rings for the iris and the sclera, which is the white part of the eye. But it wasn't very big. It was mostly the brown iris of the eye. It did not show its teeth. It did not make any other noise. It just stood up and looked at me. And I can remember the brown, I would call it cinnamon now, shiny hair that was stringy, and it wasn't matted. At that point in time, they probably did not have ghillie suits except for in the military. So I know it wasn't anything like that. I did have a 22 with me, like I said. And the fear in me just said, get rid of what was in my hands and run into the house as fast as I could, which was maybe only 30 or 40 yards from the woods into our house. Uh, Sat there holding all of that in until my stepfather got home. It was at that point he went out into the woods to find the gun that I had thrown down, and he found it stuck barrel down into the ground, down to where the stock, the handhold, uh, the barrel was buried completely in the ground, straight down. So he accused me of doing that, and I said, "There's no way. I just threw it on the ground. I did not throw it barrel down into the ground, uh, and I did not bury it like that from no. I wasn't very tall, so it was at that point he started kind of believing me because we did a lot of deer hunting back in there and squirrel hunting, and like I said, watching other animals just be animals, and he would feed them apples, the different animals, not just deer, but he liked to watch them too. And it wasn't too long after that incident he quit going hunting. And this was a man who was always in the woods, always. When he wasn't at work or with us, he was in the woods. And I'd say within 2 or 3 weeks of that incident, we moved away from there to a different part of the state. And we did move to another rural state. I mean, rural part of the state. But there were houses and farms around us. You could see them. They wasn't like stacked up on each other. Uh, us kids in the neighborhood, we would always play, and across the road from my house, there was I'd call it just a flat oak area that had lots and lots of trees, had not been developed or anything at the time, and had a natural spring running through it. My brother and I and several other boys in the neighborhood, we decided to walk that spring one day and walk the creek part of it, and went way back. I don't know how far back in the woods. We all got to feeling funny. Everybody got quiet and felt like they were being watched. And as we decided to turn around, you could notice there was somebody or something paralleling us in the trees. It would stop behind the trees, and when we'd walk, it would walk. So it wasn't too long after that started, we all ran the creek back to the main road and got to our houses. And I had never told anybody about that ever until today. Um, After that incident, I noticed there was a lot of loud steps just right across the street, which was maybe 50 to 75 yards away from our house. And I knew it wasn't squirrels because it wasn't fast jumping like squirrels would make a sound in the leaves. I could hear limbs falling, breaking. Never did hear what I guess it's called now wood knocks, but the steps were so loud. I'd heard all the animals walk through the woods with leaves and no leaves. The cows in the area were not out; they were back. They were up toward the house of the owner, and I just I just know for a fact there was something out there watching us. My brother got to noticing the same thing, and he had never said anything about it. I did after the events happened. We always felt like something was watching us from across the road, and there was nothing but a farm, pasture, the highway, and the woods that I described earlier, and very loud walking, and it would always stop at the edge of the woods or right inside the woods where you couldn't see anything. It wasn't maybe 2 or 3 weeks after those incidents kind of peaked. My brother and sister and I were at home with our mother. Uh, my stepfather was in the oil fields at the time, and he was gone. And my brother and sister and I stayed up one night, and my mom was asleep in her bedroom. And in the bedroom, there's an air conditioner that was in the window, but we lived on the side of a hill, and the air conditioner was kept up with two posts. I'm gonna say they were 6 or 7 foot tall, and plus the large air conditioner on top. My brother and sister got to hearing things walking around the house. It was cold outside, and the leaves were cracking, and you could hear and it wasn't a dog. It was 2 feet. You could hear stomp, 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 crash, crack. And then we heard something hit the side of the house. And when it hit the house, didn't knock everything off the walls. It just, you knew it was there. And it was in different places, like it was circling the house, except for the back. We had a wooden fence in the backyard there. And went in and told my mother, I said, I think you need to wake up because something is not right. Somebody's around the house. And all I could think about was a burglar at the time. And she, at that point, somebody started hitting on the back door and the back fence door. When it got louder and louder, she got her rifle out of the cabinet. And at that point, the noise started in the window where the air conditioner was. Well, I mean, you'd had to been, I don't know how tall and how strong to get on top of that thing without a ladder, but you had to be very tall, very strong. And we didn't hear it crawl, but she shot through the window. And landlord didn't like that too much, but she shot through the window and told us to get into the car, and we were gone. I mean, I've never seen her drive that fast. And we got into town and called the sheriff's office, and they went out and looked, checked around the house. Of course, it was real cold. The ground was frozen. There was nothing, no footprints, but the back door of the fence and the back door of the house had been knocked in. The fence had been knocked off the hinges, the fence door. And we were, but they couldn't find anything. Called us back out there. My mom looked through the house. Nothing was missing. The point I did forget to say that on the way into town, as we were getting away from whatever was making the noises and trying to get in the back door my mother shot at, I can remember vividly looking out the back window as we were driving away and seeing something stand on top of that air conditioner. And it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a cat, it was tall, because when its head was above the pitch of the house when it was standing on top of the air conditioner unit. And I told my mom, of course, she couldn't look. My brothers and sisters, I don't know if they looked, but that has stuck in my head since. All of these incidents have stuck in my head, and they followed me through to adulthood. We had quit hunting for a long time, and then when I started back to hunting when I was 16 and didn't have an incident until I was in my 20s and was married. We had a new land property in another part of the state, and it was rural and woods all around us and pasture. And at night, you could start hearing things move around. You can hear the coyotes go to yodeling. Those coyotes, the first two maybe sounded correct, but the next two or three were like they were far distant off, but they were more of a lower tone. They were not the normal coyote sound that I was used to hearing anyway. And then usually right after that started, you could hear I don't know what kind of birds they are, if they are even birds. I call them the bionic birds. They make a high pitched noise, it almost sounds like a mechanical noise. But it moves very fast. It can be in one place, and then the next it'd be right next to you, next minute. I can remember my neighbor sending me a picture of our fence line and wanted to know what that was standing in the edge of the woods. She was a professional photographer, and at that point, it looked like something standing in the woods. I don't know what it was. It was right at the edge, next to an old dead tree. And I told her I wasn't sure what it was at the time, but that has followed me, and I quit hunting since that point. I never ever went into the woods without a pistol and a rifle or a shotgun because I didn't know if it was following me around from part of the state. It just put the fear in me that I was dealing with something I didn't have a clue what I was dealing with. Didn't even know what it was, other than after I got older, seeing the things on TV and on as computers popped up with online capability, then I got to reading. And being a Choctaw native, I, I always heard the stories about, the wild men in the woods. So I just I just know something has been kind of following me around, or it appears that way. It may be just so many places in the rural communities.
Well, first off, man, what an incredible story. And I'm glad that you're here to share it. And I want to say thank you for being brave enough to come forward and share it. I know this is the first time you've publicly talked about it on a podcast, so I really do appreciate that. I know it takes a lot of guts to do that. I think that these things do follow people. I don't like to use the word marked or tagged, but I know that your chances of seeing another one after you've had an encounter go way up, man. Why do you think that is? Why do you think this thing has kind of followed you your whole life? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, if it is an animal, it sensed the fear in me, and at that point, I think you are, as what you said, you can't call it marked, but the fear in someone, they know that you're afraid of it. I guess it'd be like a mountain lion. Once it sensed your fear, it's going to follow you until it can either catch you or you get away.
That makes a lot of sense. I talk to a lot of people that have these encounters, and I was talking to one gentleman from North Carolina, and he had an encounter, an experience with a dog man, and this thing literally followed him for, the majority of his life. And it's weird when you see those kind of things and those things, happening. But, as a young kid, when you first had that encounter in the woods when you were hunting, obviously that had a huge impact on you. But, in what ways did that impact your life, man?
I went from being a very active outside child to staying inside, um, unless I had somebody else to play with, more of the kids in the neighborhoods. It just got to the point I quit going into the woods, and that's what I loved. That was my relaxation time, was going into the woods.
I'm the same way. Like, I go to the woods to pray. Like, I go to the woods to unplug. That's my happy place. And so many people have had these encounters and walked away to where that completely takes that away from you. And I hate that, because that's your safe place. This encounter you had with your mom's, that is absolutely wild. Has she talked about that much? Did you guys ever sit down and have a conversation about that?
She wouldn't. I would bring it up, and she remembered it, but she would not. She would not talk about it. She's no longer here, but she refused to talk about it.
I understand that. I think a lot of people are that way. I think there's a ton of people that have had encounters that just will not talk about it. And maybe it's because of her generation. Back then especially, you just didn't talk about things. When I go out in public, I look and I'm always like, man, there's probably somebody in this group of people that have had some kind of encounter and they just refuse to talk about it. But I think it's important to, people need to know. Do you think when you saw this thing, I know that it was kind of probably an outline, but do you have some more information on how this thing looked the second time you saw it when it was standing on the air conditioner unit?
Not a lot, other than what I've described. It was taller than the pitch of the house, the apex of the house, on top of the air conditioner. And we were driving away. It was cold, so the windows were starting to fog up, as we were all, me and my brother and sister, were not very happy, and we're probably crying. So it would heat up the inside of the car and fog up. But that's about all I can tell you. It did appear to be looking at us as we drove off. But like I said, it was on the dark side of the house, so it was hard to tell if it was looking away or trying to look into the window.
That's wild, man. That is really a scary encounter. Being a kid, you might not remember, but how far away was that from the very first initial encounter you had, and what was the time span between those encounters?
The distance between the two cities was about 45 miles. And the time frame, maybe 3 months, because we moved pretty quick after the first incident.
Yeah, I would say that you're probably having similar encounters with the same creature. That's what I would think. That's not that many miles for this thing to go and to follow you. Why they do that, I have no idea. That's a question, we might not ever get the answer to that question. I know you mentioned a Native American heritage, and what they called them, man. Can you go into some of the history with that, some of the things you grew up knowing about these things?
My grandmother would tell me things about when her and my father were up in the mountains. I guess it would be the Comanche Mountains, Comanche. My grandfather, my great grandfather, her father, had, I guess you'd call it a homestead on top of the mountain. He was kind of a loner, and he just would tell us, don't go in the woods. Tell my father, don't go in these woods without one of us grown up, and that something would, might come and get you. And we always thought it was him just trying to keep us close, where he could keep an eyeball on us. But the I know that there's so many Native Americans, that not just the Choctaw, but all Native Americans, I do believe, have these stories. They come down from ages to ages, and they're not just stories. Some of them, all folklore has a little truth in the myth. So you just have to know what's happening around you. I think you mentioned earlier that once you see something, uh, it kind of follows you, and again, I can't say tagged, but it smells that fear. It smelt that fear, and they believe the same thing in the Native American culture.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. I think that the thing for me is it's such a unique thing that you have so many different Native American tribes, and each one of them have their own stories of these creatures in their history. Bigfoot is written all throughout their history. I talked to a lady last week, and she was Cheyenne is what she was, and her tribe was very much engrossed into the culture of Bigfoot, and they called them the Watchers. I think that there's got to be a whole lot of truth to that, and they know what's going on because it's all in the history of their folklore and their legends. I don't know what word to use because I don't want to be disrespectful, but their legends in the way that they grew up. I talked to a guy from Montana that in their legends of Bigfoot, these things would come down from the mountains and steal the children and steal the kids and the wives, and they were bad creatures. And this lady had a different perspective. In her tribe, they were good creatures. And so it kind of, I don't know where you land with that stuff and where you're supposed to put that, but there's no right or wrong answer. But when you've had these type of encounters that shake you up and have impacted your life like you have, I'm always really curious to see what people think these things are. But man, what do you think that Bigfoot is?
I really don't know. All I can do is speculate, because I don't think it's an apex predator. If it was, then things would have already been happening, I believe. But I do think that it may be wanting a little to communicate with us as humans, whether it be a different branch of the human chain or whatever. They are curious, just like any animal, and us are curious as humans. Because if we hadn't been curious, we never would have known or had much of the things we have in our world today. It's those people that are curious that seem to find out the most.
That's a good way to sum it up. Anytime somebody says they don't know, that's the truest answer you can say. Like, we don't know. None of us know. We're taking educated guesses. I look at things through a biblical lens, and I think that sometimes they're flesh and blood, and then sometimes they're not. And that's really all I can think of. Like, I think that has to fit in the biblical context for me. And I think they could be a fallen angel. They could be Nephilim, which I think those are two different things. And so it's always interesting to me to hear what other people think and what their thoughts are on these creatures. This has completely changed the scope and the worldview of your life. Mine did the same thing. I know that I saw mine 3 different times, and I believe it was possibly the same creature, but it all happened within a 5-mile radius. And I do think that once you've seen one, they can smell fear. They understand who you are. I think they also know what a gun is, because the way that this thing behaved and the fact that this thing stuck the gun down into the ground. I was listening to a podcast. There was a lady that was on there, and she was out hunting with her kid, and she had this Bigfoot walk up on her, and she had her gun there, and the creature looked at her gun, and put its hand out, like, "Hey, stop!" And she set the gun down, and this thing just kind of after that it relaxed and walked off. They're very intelligent. They know what these things are, and they're all over the U.S. I think they're everywhere. And I'm glad that you came forward with your encounter, and you were brave enough to share that. Man, what would you say to somebody tonight that is sitting on an encounter? They don't want to talk about it, but it's something that it eats at them every day. Man, what advice would you give them?
I would just tell them to try to find a group like this or somebody that will listen and not belittle them, because I buried this for almost 50 years without telling anybody. Uh, until today, I did tell my brother, talk to my brother about it, and my stepfather. But if you bury it, then all it does is put a weight on your shoulders, and we should not be required to carry that weight. And if you do carry that weight, then it's going to just slow you down in your mental life. I believe it did me. It's just something that I'm glad that you were able to contact me and let me do this. Makes me feel a lot better.
It really does. A lot of times we don't think about what happens to you when you sit and you hold on to something for so long and you don't share it. That's the whole heartbeat of this community. That's the reason I started Mysteries Unknown. I wanted to give people, a safe place to do that. And, I appreciate you coming on and sharing something so personal that's been something you've carried for a long time. And I hope this helps you out, and I hope it makes you feel better. And, guys, if you're listening to this podcast tonight, and if you got something you would like to share with him, you can always reach out to me, and I'll get that over to him, because that's how we connect. That's how we learn. That's how we grow. I think, we're saving lives when we do this stuff, because you never know. I think that a lot of the times, people that go missing in the woods, if you look up the maps of Bigfoot encounters and missing 411 people, like, they kind of line up. And I'm not saying every single one of those is what happened, but man, your encounter was extremely scary. The one with your mom, what do you think kept you safe that night? Obviously your mom shooting at the thing kept it at bay, but the fact that this thing ripped open the door and broke in your house after you left, man, what do you think kept y'all safe that night?
Personally, I think it was, we had the hand of God on us, because who knows what that thing could have done. And it got in the house apparently after we left, even though it had been knocking, trying to knock the door down. But I honestly believe it was the hand of God that protected us.
I agree with that, man. 100% agree with that. I think that there's so many encounters that I come across. It just blows my mind that when people have these type of encounters, when they call on the name of Jesus, these things will absolutely leave. There was Daryl Denton's been on the show before, and he was telling me about an encounter that him and Martin Gross had, and they were way out in the middle, somewhere in the LBL, and they were all surrounded by these creatures, by Dogman, by Bigfoot. And he said they kept getting closer and closer, and he was extremely scared. And he said that Martin went outside and started reading scripture and started to invoke the name of the Lord, and these things just left, like completely left and walked off. And so, I think that there's got to be some kind of supernatural aspect to these things because of that. It's the only thing that makes sense to me. And, I 100% agree with you. I think you definitely had the hand of God on you that day. I think I know the answer to this, but would you want to see this thing again if you had the opportunity?
Myself, no, not at all. It's just not something that I would want to deal with, because I personally don't feel safe. But that's just my opinion.
That's a good opinion. I agree with that opinion. I'll share something that I've started to talk about a little bit. I don't talk about it a whole lot, but I'd interviewed this guy, and I'd referred to him earlier in the podcast, but he had a really strange encounter with Dogman. And it was weird because all I can tell you is there's something that just felt off. And after being a cop for so long, you kind of develop this sixth sense. You kind of can tell when something is, off. And there was, at the time in my studio, there was two big windows over here, and there was some woods way off to the side. And I was just very uncomfortable the whole time I was doing the interview. And all I can tell you is I felt like something was watching me, right? And I trust that after being a cop for so long, you learn to trust that feeling. It saved my life, and I firmly believe that's God. I think God gives you that. But the next day, I had a shoot to do, and I was on my way to do this shoot, and I took this really rural route, and it was way in the middle of nowhere in Arkansas. And I know you probably know exactly where I'm talking about because, it's not far from where you're at. But I was driving this route, and I had to use the bathroom. And I stopped, and there was nothing around. I just found this dirt road. I drove way off down this dirt road, and there was no homes there or anything. And I get out. The second my foot hits the ground, I knew something's off. Like, I instantly knew something was watching me out in the woods. And the strange things about it, it was the same feeling I had when I initially had my encounter at 14 years old. And for you guys who don't know that story, when I had this encounter with this thing, I felt extreme hatred from this thing. Like it wanted to rip my head off. Like, it was not a good encounter, not a good experience. Now, guys, I'm not saying that every Bigfoot is evil. What I am saying, what I encountered was not good. And I had the same exact feeling that day. And I knew that something, it wasn't a person, was out there watching me. Am I saying it was Dogman? No, but could it be? Yeah. I knew it was some kind of cryptid that felt like that. Yeah, man, I got in my car and I jetted out of there. So I'm like you, man. I have no desire to see these things again. I'm more than happy to sit in this chair and hear everybody else's encounters. So I don't blame you for that. I think that's a smart move, man. I really do appreciate you coming on the show, being brave enough. And thank you for sharing that encounter with me. And I'm glad you were here to tell it.
Well, thanks for listening.
Absolutely. Guys, thanks for hanging out with us tonight. It's such a strange world we live in. There's so many things. I say it all the time in God's universe. We just don't understand. We may never get the answers to this thing, but we also can learn a little bit along the way, maybe save a life and educate people. And if you're sitting there tonight and you are sitting on an encounter, you've been afraid to come forward with it, I can promise you this is a safe place to do that. You can always email me at mysteriesunknownpodcast@gmail.com. Even if you just want to talk to somebody about your encounter and don't want to come on the show, I would love to hear your stories. I could not do this podcast without you and people like him that's brave enough to talk about it. Some of these creatures out there are not good. Some of them could be, but some of them are not. And it amazes me how there's two different sides of this story. You have encounters where they're just like his, they're absolutely terrifying. You have some that are just simple roadside crossings. Why the difference is there, I don't know. But I'm just glad I get to be here and facilitate this and share these encounters with you. But thanks again for hanging out with us tonight. I'm going to say it. Stay prayed up. We'll see you in the next episode.